Okay, so I have a confession to make. I'm an anthropologist, and as such, I'm not sure I know exactly what spirituality is. I'm not sure I know what Jewish spirituality is, and actually, I'm not even sure I know what Judaism is. I think probably the only wise thing I learned in high school, I learned many things in high schools, but from my teachers, is that there's no such thing as Judaism. And as my Mishnah teacher said, if somebody asks you what Judaism says about something, tell them you do not know. So there are many types of Judaism, many types of spirituality, many ways to understand spirituality. And as an anthropologist, I've been accused before by Yutam that us social scientists, all you care about are facts and reality. So yeah, I care about facts and reality. And I'm interested in the way contemporary people, contemporary Jews construct the notion of Jewish spirituality. What does it mean to them? What do they think about it? And they do so out of certain specific cultural contexts. So if I was to research what does spiritual but not religious mean for Israeli Jews, I would probably get a very different answer than what does spiritual but not religious mean to secular Christian Americans, or to those people, to those poor, homeless African American women that done research. And he remarked earlier after Bill Parsons' lecture. So I would like to begin. Okay, so in my lecture, I would like to look more broadly on the notion of Jewish spirituality. Okay, so I'm looking into the notion of Jewish spirituality, and I try to look or attempt to discern how specific groups of Jews, more precisely non-Orthodox Jews, relate and construct and negotiate the idea of Jewish spirituality vis-a-vis other cultural categories, traditional understandings of Judaism, Jewish mysticism, and spirituality. And then I'd like to begin with a quote taken from Makom. It's a JCC Manhattan website, and promoting a project entitled Makom Jewish Spirituality. At Makom, we explore Jewish spiritual practice and make the time to illuminate various aspects of Jewish mysticism. Through workshops and retreats centered on Jewish contemplative practice, monthly evenings of Jewish chant, opportunity to study the ethical practice of Musar, there you go, Shaul, and more, Makom provides an oasis for Jewish spirituality in the midst of the noise of the city. So JCC Manhattan is not the only Jewish organization to capitalize on the notion of Jewish spirituality. From JCC Manhattan through the Mindfulness Meditation Inclined Institute for Jewish Spirituality, even to Chabad and Yeshivat Eish Torah, Jewish spirituality has become a buzzword in the contemporary Jewish spiritual marketplace. And if you run a Google search for the word Jewish spirituality, resulted, and it's probably gone even upper, it's no less than 3,190,000 hits. And if you look for Jewish spirituality in Google Books, you'd get 27,700 results. 27,700 results. So yeah, people are using it and using it a lot. So what exactly is Jewish spirituality, and why has this concept become so popular? And how is it related to the broader cultural and religious processes that are going on today in today's globalized world? So I'm looking at Jewish spirituality not as a thing to itself that I leave to scholars of Jewish mysticism or philosophy, but I'm looking at it as an emerging cultural category, as a social construct. This category, I claim, and various social phenomena that are derived from it are both related to the earlier discursive category of Jewish mysticism, and I'm drawing on Baz Huss's work on this issue, and at the same time is firmly linked to the broader non-Jewish phenomena of New Age spiritualities. So in this term, I refer to the variety of new creative Jewish cultural configurations, and these are a few images of this type of groups and things that are going on today. It ranges from Neo-Hasidism to the North American trans-denominational Jewish Renewal movement. These movements are usually not affiliated with institutionalized denominations, and a great part of them can be even described as grassroots initiatives. Such is the case of the 60s Chavura movement, the Jewish Renewal movement, and the newer Jewish mindfulness groups. All of these different configurations claim to be authentic forms of Jewish spirituality, inspired by various streams of Jewish mysticism. So, while the engagement with the concept is very different and it varies between those groups, they do have some shared characteristics, which I will try to delineate here. So the first would be the turn to Jewish mysticism, and especially to Hasidism. The second would be cultural hybridity. And the third would be the primacy of the subjective experience over commitment to institutionalized forms of Judaism. I will conclude my lecture by suggesting that this phenomena may very well offer a challenge to some of the prevailing social theory regarding contemporary spiritualities, especially to the individualization of religion thesis. According to the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, the contemporary individualization of religion has wrought a turn from religion, i.e. institutional, communal, and traditional, to religiosity, whereby one's spiritual life is allegedly constructed by the individual, removed from the dictates of tradition, and detached from organized collective forms of religious belonging. I will argue that in the case of Jewish spirituality, the inward turn does not necessarily result in the severing of the tie of the individual with his primordial community. Instead, what it does, it offers an alternative model for Jewish sociality. So, as I noted before, the concept of Jewish spirituality has become immensely popular in recent years. And here I'm using another Google tool, very cool tool. This is actually a graph of the use of the term Jewish spirituality in publication of books. So what we can see is that we have, beginning from mid-50s, we can find publications referring to Jewish spirituality. But what we can see is that we're going, very straight, going up in somewhere in the mid-70s. So in the mid-70s, suddenly there's the burst of people that are referring to Jewish spirituality. So obviously something has happened in that time, in the 70s, so it's pretty obvious. And there's some sort of change in the term of zeitgeist regarding the notion of spirituality, both general and Jewish spirituality in particular. So what has changed? So what I claim that one of the central things that happened is the distinction. Of course, beginning with the counterculture and the hippie culture, a distinction has been formed between institutionalized, organized, authoritative, and collective religion, and non-institutionalized, decentralized, autonomous spirituality. So today, spirituality is understood as antithesis of religion. And this binary distinction undergirds most of the popular and academic discourse on contemporary spiritualities, that's as Bill lecture discussed before. But the turn from religion to spirituality, I contend, is also related to other cultural trends. The first is the individualization of religion, which I mentioned before, and the second is a subjective turn. As Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor described, the subjective turn of modern culture is a formation of new form of inwardness in which we come to think of ourselves as beings with inner depth. According to Hillas and Woodhead, it is a major cultural shift of which we all have some experience, away from a life lived in terms of external objective roles, duties and obligations, and a turn towards life lived by reference to one's own subjective experience. This turn is also reflected in Judaism. In 2000, Stephen Cohen and Arnold Eisen published their book, The Jew Within. This book, which focuses on the moderately affiliated North American Jews, demonstrates that as far as these people are concerned, the meaning of Judaism transpires within the self. American Jews have drawn the activity and significance of the group identity onto the subjectivity of the individual, the activities of the family and few institutions which are seen as extensions of the intimate sphere. So not unlike non-Jewish spiritual seekers, they too adopt a pick-and-choose approach, whereby the only criterion governing the selection is what is meaningful to the self. There is no longer any need to claim obedience to higher authority, and also no need to rebel against such authority. So into this individualized and subjectivized religious era that the idea of Jewish spirituality has magnificently blossomed. So I want to turn now into two other quotes taken from Jewish spirituality institutions, which also discuss what they think of Jewish spirituality is. So Torah is the foundation of Jewish life, and the study of Torah has been the energizing force of Jewish spirituality. Whatever else we might teach our participants to help them wake up and experience the presence of God in their lives, the core of our teaching is Torah. But now we're moving further. I'm going to the last paragraph. The Institute continues a spirit of neo-Hasidism, which began to grow in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and which now has substantial roots in America. In our study, we explore, renew, and apply the riches of Jewish spiritual traditions, especially emphasizing the teachings of mysticism and classic Hasidic thought that relate to personal transformation and the ability to remain engaged in repairing the world. And here is we come to the nutshell of this. We at the Institute have been introduced to mindfulness meditation as a path that can support and sustain our Jewish lives and the fulfillment of our Jewish values. We're dedicated to introducing this practice into Jewish world for several reasons. Okay, now you can read the rest. So what can we learn from these quotes about Jewish spirituality? So first of all, we learned that Jewish spirituality is inspired by Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah and Hasidism. In some cases, the influence is so strong that the groups describe themselves as neo-Hasidic. The most popular Hasidic schools for Jewish spiritualities, I would say, is first and foremost the 18th century Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the Ishbitzer Rabbi of 19th century, and the mid-20th century Rabbi of Piaseczna. And I think two other Hasidic schools, if they can be called schools, are now becoming popular, and that would be the writing of the Harav Shagal and the Harav Holon. So why Dafka these Hasidic rabbis and schools? A plausible explanation would be...
Try again.
Okay. A plausible explanation would be that all these schools and texts have strong psychological qualities in the writing and practices. Second, while Jewish spirituality is inspired by Jewish, mostly Hasidic texts, it tends to focus less on intellectual study and more on spiritual practice. The origins of these practices are often non-Jewish. Such is the case of Jewish mindfulness. The Jewish version of the Buddhist mindfulness meditative techniques, which have become increasingly popular in America today. Also the practice of Jewish chanting, which adapts Indian, Hindu, and Sufi practice of devotional chant. In other words, Jewish spirituality tends to be hybrid and eclectic, drawing simultaneously on Jewish textual traditions and practices and non-Jewish practice, especially those from the Far East. By picking and mixing various cultural traditions, both Jewish and non-Jewish, Jewish spirituality creates a cultural bricolage, deemed by its adherents as Jewish spirituality. So why are these different practices considered spiritual? How do they convince their practitioners of their spiritualness? I would argue that the central feature in nearly all of these modalities is the one that perceives spiritual practice as a technique for self-transformation. Like the wider New Age spiritualities, Jewish spirituality emphasizes the self, its well-being, transformation, and realization. In fact, it adopts a contemporary conception according to which spiritual experience is a personal, subjective, self-transformative experience in the presence of the divine or ultimate reality. By emphasizing the authentic self and even sacralizing it, Jewish spirituality fuses the mystical with the psychological. Practices aimed at spiritual enlightenment, such as meditation, become techniques of the self, to borrow Foucault's term, directed towards self-realization and development. In their construction of Jewish spirituality, the activists draw on academic scholarship on Kabbalah and Hasidism. As Hus notes, this scholarship was influenced by the general scholarly work on mysticism, which defined the mystical experience as the unmediated contact of man with the divine or the metaphysical. Premised on this definition, the modern study of Kabbalah and Hasidism refers to its subject matter as Jewish mysticism and regards it as a particular national Jewish form of a universal mysticism. This perspective allows Jewish spirituality adherents, some of which are also scholars of Kabbalah and Hasidism themselves, to conceive Kabbalah and Hasidism as a spiritual core of Judaism, hence the authentic Jewish framework for spiritual development and personal enlightenment. Yet, unlike the category of Jewish mysticism, which developed out of mid-century national Zionist ideology, Jewish spirituality is a product of a very different era. In a multicultural age, Jewish mysticism is now reiterated as Jewish spirituality. As such, it is presented as a universal, albeit ethnic, spiritual wisdom. The contemporary cultural demand for the personal, individual acknowledgement of the cultural Okay, can I look at this? I do multitasking with that. Okay, now I understand what I'm saying. This is not... Okay, got it. When I talk about the Jewish Spirituality Institute, I'm not talking about this institute. Okay? That's to make it clear.
Okay.
Yeah, the website is... Yeah, it's very...
Spirituality and society.
Yeah. Okay, the contemporary cultural demand for the personal, individual acknowledgement of cultural and ethnic roots leads Jewish spirituality activists to present Kabbalah and Hasidism as both universal and Jewish at the same time. To some, Jewish spirituality strives to revive authentic Jewish spiritual practice. Ironically, in order to realize this goal, it reimagined the Jewish tradition and invents Jewish practice by hybridizing it with non-Jewish religious practices. The objective of these practices is not theurgical, but therapeutic. Jewish mysticism is rebirthed as a hyper-individual, self-centered spiritual technique. In this sense, it is very similar to other New Age spiritual techniques and methods, like the work that Don mentioned, Veronique Altla's work on the Kabbalah Center. Yet it is also very different from them, at least in regard to the relationship between the individual and the collective. Okay. As noted, New Age spiritualities are emblematic of the spirit of the individualization of religion, in which contemporary religious forms are construed in opposition to organized and communal religions. Jewish spirituality, however, creates a different set of relations between the individual and his community. While most of the activities that have carried this label take place outside denominational synagogues, they are still held in collective settings, small, non-formal group retreats, weekend workshops, and the like. Indeed, the search for Jewish spirituality results in the formation of new modes of sociality, in which ad hoc engagement with alternative communities replaces the lifelong commitment to established denominations and synagogues. Thus, it reveals that the personal search for spiritual development, enmeshed with self-transformation, does not necessarily negate the wish to belong to a religious or ethnic collective. While small, heterogeneous in size, and ephemeral, these new associative bonds and elective tribes indicate the important role that collectivity still plays in contemporary Jewish life. Thank you.